New Scientist magazine just reported that cars can now run on hazelnuts. And then Jimmy Fallon said, yeah, that's reassuring, because hazelnuts cost like $8 for a bottle this big. You know, what about a car that runs on bald eagle heads or Fabergé eggs? And I thought later, wait a second, but isn't hazelnut energy renewable energy? Isn't it renewable energy, right? It comes from the sun. So why is it so expensive? And it illustrates this profound point that we need to understand to evaluate different sources of energy, which is that energy is a process. Energy is not a single material, it's a process. So when we talk about solar energy or wind energy or coal, it can be misleading, because the question is, what is the entire process that includes but is not limited to those elements that produces the end product that we want, and maybe end products that we don't? So we have to look at the whole process. So all of these different variables, from mining to transportation to disposal. So when people talk about things like zero emissions or no pollution, usually they're only looking at one part of the process. And when people have wildly optimistic expectations about some new source of energy, like let's say hydrogen, they have no idea what's going into manufacturing the hydrogen fuel. They just like, oh, hydrogen's in the air, it's in reality, so that'll make it super, super cheap. So we have to recognize, no, energy is a process. So there are different things that can make a form of energy expensive. I think the biggest one and the most problematic part of a process is if the process is unreliable, if it cannot generate energy on demand. And this is the problem that solar and wind run into. Now, solar and wind, it's very weird, this classification of renewables, because it's in our actual law, it usually excludes hydroelectric power, even though that's plenty renewable if you think of things in those terms, if you think of things as renewable. So again, there's this green bias that, oh, it has too much impact, it has nothing to do with CO2. But I think solar and wind are properly, I do not call them renewables, I call them unreliables, because I think that is the distinctive quality, because the energy we get is not on demand. And so what happens is that, well, let's look at the case of Germany, which is supposed to be the model country. It's invested hundreds of billions of dollars, or spent hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidizing solar and wind. Well, according to today's rhetoric, that should make it cheaper, because you hear all these cost things. But those cost things never take into account the fact that if you have unreliables on a system, you need them backed up almost 100%. And so that's why Germany is keeps building a lot of new coal plants. And so in practice, Germans pay 3 times more for electricity, sometimes 4, depending on conversion, than people in the US do. And that's at only about 10% of their entire energy comes from these unreliables. The more they use, the more it costs. So there's an immense amount of dishonesty and bias in the energy discussion, because the privileged forms of energy, people aren't looking carefully at the process. And then the other forms of energy, people don't appreciate. So I think that if you look at the entire, if you actually look at the data, and again, this is on the website, moralcaseforfossilfuels.com/data, if you look at the data, you look at the different forms of energy, I think what you conclude is that fossil fuel energy for the next several decades is uniquely good at producing energy on a scale of billions of people. Nuclear power probably has the most potential to, except for the green movement is restricting it. And so one of the huge priorities for all sides of the debate, unless you're just unless being green is really a religion, is to liberate nuclear power and to allow advancement in that field, and to also allow hydroelectric power where it's possible. So I think those are still the biggest ones. And of course, we want innovation in these other areas, but fossil fuel energy is uniquely good at this point. Now, this is particularly important because it's not that we have a world where everyone has plenty of energy and we just need to substitute something. First of all, we don't have nearly enough energy. If we had a lot more energy, we could do things like desalinate water and seawater and irrigate deserts and solve all sorts of problems. But there are 1.2 billion people in the world with no electricity. Think about that. No electricity, no light bulb, no refrigerator, no modern hospital, none. And then on top of that, there are 2.7 billion people who have so little energy, they're in such a state of energy poverty, that they use wood and dung to cook and heat their homes. So we have a world where basically 3 billion people are wretchedly energy poor. And so the energy question is not just how to keep our energy, but how to produce more energy, which means that given fossil fuels' unique ability to be resource efficient and produce energy on the scale, it doesn't prove that they don't have problems or even big problems, but it does prove that there's a huge burden of proof in restricting the use of fossil fuels. So if you talk about, hey, let's tax them, or let's, as many people advocate, let's strive to get rid of 80% of fossil fuel use, current fossil fuel use, by the year 2050, when there will be an even bigger population, that is a really serious thing to do. And when you hear those things, don't think of it as, oh yeah, it's just sort of like buying, I'm going to buy a Tesla. It's not even, Tesla is a massively impressive fossil fuel car at this stage in terms of the amount of fossil fuels that go in. And it's great. It's a great kind of invention, and we want to support those things. We shouldn't be giving them a lot of subsidies, I think. But this is just you're talking about a massive disruption in people's lives, particularly the poorest people. So at the very least, you cannot advocate these kinds of things casually. Now let's talk about the concerns. So there are 3 major concerns about fossil fuels: catastrophic resource depletion, so running out of fossil fuels or overall consuming more than we can. There's this idea of we're at overcapacity, we're wearing out our welcome on the planet. Catastrophic pollution, so by using fossil fuels, leaving aside CO2, there are all these destructive byproducts. And then, of course, catastrophic climate change, which is that we're elevating CO2 levels and other greenhouse gas levels to the point where there's runaway warming and catastrophic climate change. So I want to focus on the climate issue, because I think it's the issue of most concern today, and I think it's also the most plausible. The depletion issue has lost a lot of steam in recent years, because most of the development people call fracking or shale energy, which is that the oil and gas industry has been able to take a useless rock that was known to contain some amount of oil and gas, but we couldn't get it out, and to economically get it out. And so that, for decades and decades and decades going forward, has alleviated fears of running out of oil, and oil is the hardest to replace fossil fuel. Coal, you have probably thousands of years left, even of known deposits. But it is important, I think, to understand the general mechanism. And this chart is interesting, because I think what it shows is that it shows the consumption line at the bottom goes up a little bit. So what it shows, and then proved reserves is basically an inventory. So it means the more we use, the more we have. I think this is a really profound kind of thing. And what it illustrates in the case of oil is that nature doesn't just give us like a lake of oil and then we're draining it with a straw and then we're halfway through. Nature is full of potential oil in all these different rock deposits, but it takes human ingenuity to make it valuable. It takes human ingenuity to find it, to get it, and to refine it. Back in the 1850s, before the oil industry began, oil was a nuisance. It was useless. It was something people sold as fake medicine or that got in the way when they were searching for salt. So the principle, which is really important to having optimism about humanity, including about energy, is that human beings are resource producers or resource creators. A resource is not something nature gives us. It's where nature gives us a raw material and we make it usable. So aluminum is not a natural resource because it's not naturally a resource. It's naturally useless. Oil isn't a natural resource. Coal isn't a natural resource. Gas isn't a natural resource. Uranium isn't a natural resource. All of these things are resources only to the extent human beings can transform them into usable things. And the whole world is just a pile of potential resources. So we should never be worried about running out of oil or running out of coal or running out of gas or running out of resources. We should only be worried about running out of freedom. Because as long as we're free, we can keep figuring out ways to transform raw materials into resources. And as we progress with the kinds of things that Google and lots of other amazing companies do, our effective intelligence just multiplies over and over and over. So who knows what we'll be able to turn into a resource. So that's the depletion one. The pollution one is important because I think it's worth noting that when people talk about the effects of energy on environment, they only talk about negative ones. So there's this idea of there's clean energy and there's dirty energy. That's a problem, first of all, because every form of energy has byproducts, so it's too binary a classification, although some are cleaner or dirtier than others. But I think the thing that's really missing from this narrative is that energy has an enormous power to clean up nature. The environment we live in is the cleanest any human being has ever lived in history, I mean, on average across the planet. If our ancestors 300 years ago, before we started using fossil fuels, before we industrialized, could see our environment and we asked them who has a better environment, you or us, they would think it was a joke, right? They were living in filth, in human filth and animal filth, surrounded by disease. Nature doesn't give us a clean environment that we then make dirty. It gives us a dirty environment that we make clean. So when we're analyzing the environmental impact of different forms of energy, we have to look at both how it cleans and how it makes things dirty. Because if you say, oh, I don't want this energy because it's dirty, but then you lose the energy. So for example, there's a reason for this correlation here, which is with cleanliness of water and use of fossil fuels, which to date is most of energy use, because you need water to purify, you need energy to purify naturally dirty water and to transport it from where it is to where you need it to be. Now, it doesn't have to be fossil fuels, theoretically, but given that fossil fuels are the most practical form of energy for billions of people today, it does have to be fossil fuels. So when you deprive people of fossil fuels, you deprive them of things like clean water. Now, what about actual pollution? I think this chart does a good job of showing what's possible. Using technology, we can reduce negative byproducts. And that's fantastic, and we should continue to do that. A modern coal plant, a truly modern coal plant, is one of the cleanest sources of energy in history. I mean, what we've been able to do is amazing, and what we can continue to do is amazing. So we should absolutely seek cleaner and cleaner processes. But this idea that pollution is getting worse and worse, that's simply not true.